All right. It is now time for our talk. And if you printed the program or glanced at what Harry sent us, he chose a very appropriate picture, one that we're familiar with. It's known as the Scream. It was painted in 1893 by Edward Munch, but whether you have a stress ball, stress balloon, often the picture of the scream, the original name was the Scream of Nature. We know that picture. So thank you, Harry, for choosing that. We appreciate it. Now, for my intro of somebody we know well, Mike Ivey. He has served as our vice president, has for years done our emails, and we know him well. He's our person that's probably works the hardest of all of us to live simply and live close to nature. So we honor that effort because having done it somewhat, it's not easy. I asked Mike what words of intro I might offer for him, and I'll read what Mike typed. He said he probably needed to ask Karen on how to introduce him. Then he came up with some words. He says, I have lots of opinions about nearly everything, but I really dislike social media. So today is a way I can share my opinions with some you friends. So Mike, we look forward to your talk on fear, anger, sadness, hope, and despair, emotional responses to crises. Mike, thank you very much for doing this.
Okay. So the actual original title was what Jane just read, except it's emotional responses to existential threats. When I saw that Randy was talking about existentialism last Sunday, I thought that sounded like it would be confusing, but that's actually what I'm talking about. So simply paying attention to the news can subject us to a roller coaster ride of emotional reactions. We may feel fearful because of the pandemic, or heavily armed crazy people, or violent militarized police. There are hundreds of events that can rouse our anger, ranging from obnoxious displays of bigotry, to politicians who sell us out, to billionaires who get richer and richer while people are homeless and hungry. Likewise, there are hundreds of causes of sadness, including people suffering from the pandemic and the many victims of war. But for this talk, I want to focus on what have come to be called existential threats, which unfortunately has nothing to do with existentialism. It refers to events that would cause the total destruction of human civilization, reduce the human population to a small fraction of what it is now, and cause the extinction of many other species. I'll briefly mention two of these threats, then focus mainly on the third one. I'll be talking about my own emotional responses. Your feelings may be similar or entirely different. I'm trying to keep this short enough that we can have a good discussion afterward. First thing I want to consider is the possibility of a large asteroid colliding with the Earth. Not only would it kill millions of people directly, it would also initiate earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would make it impossible to grow enough food. Billions of people would probably die. And yet, I don't live in fear of this happening. In fact, I rarely even think about it. Why is that? We know it has happened before, maybe several times, and it will probably happen again, eventually. But spreading the risk out over millions of years does reduce the sense of immediacy. And I believe there's another factor that influences my reaction. This is something that is totally beyond human influence. Nothing we do can either cause it or prevent it. Therefore, worrying about it is pointless. I remain hopeful, based on probability, that this event is at least tens of thousands of years in the future. In contrast with this is the threat of nuclear war. It would have most of the devastating effects of an asteroid collision, plus lethal radiation and the deadly contamination of soil, water, and air. And this threat is entirely under human control. Only we can cause it or prevent it, which is why it scares the hell out of me. One mentally unstable leader of a country with nuclear weapons could initiate the near total destruction of life on Earth. And it seems that a disproportionately large number of national leaders are mentally unstable. In order to eliminate the threat of nuclear war, it would be necessary to completely change the policies of several national governments. So you and I actually have about as much influence over nuclear war as we do the asteroid. Therefore, I live with the fear, as I have been doing for more than 50 years now. I don't think about it often, unless world events create a crisis. Mostly it's a nearly unconscious awareness that lurks in the shadows. But I do have a little bit of hope. Most sane people recognize the insanity of nuclear war. I continue to have hope that the sane people will prevail. The third existential threat is, of course, climate change, or more accurately, climate destruction, climate chaos, or climate collapse. I see this as the ultimate manifestation of our abuse and exploitation of our natural environment. So I want to talk about it in that context. Since I was about 14 years old, I've been deeply concerned about the abuse and destruction of the natural world. And it made me angry. I was angry at corporations that dumped toxic waste into rivers or belched it into the air. I was angry at government agencies that allowed healthy forests to be turned into tree farms. I was angry at the companies responsible for strip mines and oil spills. I was angry at local governments that allowed woods and fields to become housing developments. But I was also angry at a lot of ordinary people. For a while, I naively thought that people just needed to be educated about the problems and they would change their behavior. Not the corporate people who were making piles of money from their abuses, but common folks like us. If they just realized how they were contributing to the destruction, many, not all, but many, would change. Some things seemed obvious. Burning fossil fuels pollutes the air. Driving a car with a big engine pollutes more than driving one with a smaller engine. Some connections were less obvious. Using more electricity contributes to air pollution and strip mining. Buying cheap plastic junk contributes to pollution from the factories that made it, as well as the fossil fuels it was made from and with, and so on and so on. At the time, there were several organizations trying very hard to educate people about these issues. We all know the result. People did not rush to trade in their Buicks and Oldsmobiles and Corvettes for Corollas and Volkswagens. And they drove more every year. They continued to buy air conditioners and clothes dryers and trash compactors and garbage disposals. They bought more and more junk, then built bigger homes to have room for it. And these people made me angry. They were no longer acting from ignorance. They simply didn't care. They were polluting my air and my water, clear-cutting my forests, strip mining my mountains, and killing off millions of animals that were much better neighbors than these humans. It's not that I thought they were evil, but they were selfish. They cared more about their own pleasure than about the harm they were doing. They acted like irresponsible children. Now let's look at climate change. People began to speculate about human-caused climate change as early as the 1890s. By the 1970s, there was growing evidence that it was a reality. By the 1980s, it was established fact. By the 1990s, it was perfectly clear that if we didn't all drastically change our behavior immediately, the results would be cataclysmic, especially for future generations. Surely, I thought, this would motivate people. Governments took the lead in making symbolic gestures to affirm their good intentions while actually doing nothing meaningful. Many ordinary people took a similar approach. They changed their behavior in superficial ways, demonstrating their good intentions, as long as they weren't inconvenienced or made less comfortable or required to give anything up. Other people just refused to accept any responsibility for the situation and made no changes at all. Hardly anyone was willing to make real sacrifices so that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren might have better lives, or maybe even have lives at all. Here's an analogy. A man sees a small child struggling in the water, in danger of drowning. He wants to help, but if he goes into the water, he will get his clothes wet. The water is cold and probably dirty, so he would have to stand around in dirty, wet clothes. He might get chilled, and he would get his car seat wet and dirty. He's really sorry he can't do something. Maybe the kid will learn to swim. This is how I see people responding to climate change. I've come to believe that most people have the emotional and moral development of your average chimpanzee. And when I say that, I mean no disrespect to chimpanzees. They are simply what they have evolved to be. They are the most selfish and most violent of the ape species, and they are our closest relatives. We are essentially hairless chimpanzees with a little more intelligence and lots of technology. So maybe selfishness is a fundamental part of human nature, and people are just being what they have evolved to be. Expecting anything better is unrealistic. The nice thing about this view is that it lets me get over being angry at everybody. The problem with this view is the counterexample provided by those people who are truly altruistic and compassionate. They have raised the bar for all of us by showing what we should all be capable of. Which leaves me feeling deeply disappointed in all the rest of us. And I do include myself. Mostly I feel sad. I'm not usually the kind of person who believes the opposite of optimism is realism. But in this case, it appears to be. The destruction of Earth's climate is happening now. We're already in the middle of it. The effects not only get worse every year, but build on each other and multiply. It's too late to stop it. It's much too late to reverse it. If everyone on Earth stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, it would only slow the destruction slightly. 20 years ago, we might have stopped it. 10 years ago, there was still some hope. Now, there is no hope. I know some people will protest that there's always hope, and I'm sympathetic to that view. But there really isn't anything to be hopeful about. And it's a great disservice to everyone especially young people, to pretend that there is. The situation is already very bad and is going to get much, much worse. Extreme weather events will become more frequent and more severe. Agriculture will suffer. People will starve. Millions of people will be displaced by flooding. Economies will fail. Ecosystems will collapse. More and more species will disappear forever. I know we all wish that something would miraculously correct the damage we've done, but it would indeed be a miracle. I don't believe hoping for miracles is helpful. We need to accept the inevitability of what's coming and prepare ourselves to face it. I don't fear what's coming. Fear arises from uncertainty. It's usually fear of the unknown. We pretty well know what's going to happen. It's as if the asteroid has been spotted, the collision is certain, and we're just waiting for it. What I feel, besides a lot of sadness, is resignation. Selfishness has defeated compassion. Hedonism has prevailed, and we will all suffer the consequences. I try to minimize the harm I do in the world, but not because it will make any difference. I just don't want to contribute to the harm. We can all look for opportunities to express love and compassion, and those opportunities will be plentiful as times get worse. The challenges ahead will bring out the best in some people and the worst in others. If you need something to feel hopeful about, you can hope that people will rise to the occasion and become more compassionate. But I'm not holding my breath.